Listen to Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State for Housing, and his statement on cladding. Here he is.
I'm therefore, today, making an exceptional intervention on behalf of the government and providing certainty that leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings will face no cost for cladding remediation works. We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England.
Well, that was Robert Jenrick. Greg Dawson, our reporter, has been covering this ever since it began, not long after Grenfell Tower. Greg, just again summarise the headlines of this announcement and statement from Robert Jenrick.
So 2 key points. If your building has unsafe cladding and is above 18 metres, the government...
England.
Yes, in England. The government has gone further than the initial promise of £1.6 billion to remediate those buildings. It said now, basically, if your building is above 18 metres, the government will meet that cost. Now, crucially, there are hundreds of buildings that are under 18 metres, with people saying, well, what about us? What the Housing Secretary has confirmed is that the government will provide a low-interest, long-term loan where people will not repay anything greater than £50 per month for the removal of that cladding.
Right, so that means there won't be any costs. I just heard Robert Jenrick saying for remedial works, as he called it, for those leaseholders in buildings above 18 metres in England.
No, but the key point is a lot of them say this is not just about buildings covered in dangerous cladding, but just about fire safety in the building. So lots of these buildings that I've been to have wooden balconies. That's not cladding. They have fire cavity problems. There's a problem with the fire alarm. So this still potentially, well, obviously the Housing Secretary is still on his feet, but it still potentially leaves them on the hook for thousands of pounds of other costs.
Right, well, let's talk to one of those affected. Giles Grover can talk to us now. Hello, Giles. You're in a 12-storey flat in Manchester that has flammable cladding on it. Is that right?
Good afternoon. Yes, I am. We have the same style cladding as the Grenfell tragedy, as well as other serious safety issues. Now,
no doubt you've been listening closely to what Robert Jenrick has said so far. What's your initial reaction?
It's not good enough. It's not a solution at all. It's still dealing with half of the problem. Extending the money is fine, but it's still a fraction of the actual costs that are required. We've still got a range of issues that are not funded, whether it's internal issues with balconies, as has been mentioned, or serious structural issues. And essentially to leave behind the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in buildings under 18 metres is not acceptable. Even if you give us those... Sorry.
No, don't apologise. Giles, we have a minister here from the government, Robert Courts, obviously not specifically with responsibility for this, but what can you say to Giles? It's still only solving half the problem.
Well, firstly, clearly we'll never forget the terrible tragedy of Grenfell, and I do very much sympathise with all of those who are in flats that are affected. And what's very clear at this stage is that in addition to the £1.6 billion the government has already said that they'd put in, there is now a very, very substantial further tranche of government help, and I hope that will be welcome. It's very difficult for me to comment upon the specifics of Giles' situation, but I'm sure everybody will be listening carefully to his concerns.
Right. Giles, what would you like to say to the minister about what should be done?
What should be done is the money should be put up front for all buildings that require remediation. There needs to be a proper assessment of risk for all buildings, not just over 18 metres, because under 18 metres as well. To say that we're going to give you loans to fix issues that just aren't our fault, you can say it's £50 a month, but how long is that for? It might be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. It will ruin all property prices. It'll push thousands into negative equity. It's not a solution. They need to go back to the drawing board.
Robert?
Well, I would just refer to the very substantial step that the government has taken today. This is a major, exceptional government intervention, as the Secretary of State for Housing has just said just now, and I'm sure all of those concerns will be taken on board. But I do think this is a major step forward that should be welcomed.
Right. Do you think the government will go back, though, and reassess and perhaps look at the situation for people living in buildings of under 18 metres so that they're not getting loans that they then have to pay back, Robert?
Well, you've just heard the Secretary of State speak literally now, so he would have given out a great deal of detail in his statement there. And of course, I'm quite confident that the concerns that have been raised will be heard. Some of them there may be some answers to, and the others will be heard. But I think we should welcome this major step forward, this exceptional government intervention that we've heard today.
Giles?
I could welcome it if he wants, but we know it's not enough. We've been pushing for a proper, full solution for all buildings for 2 years now. And the government's now listening to it because they realise that all the MPs are now fighting it, all the media are covering it. But right now, you're still forcing a lot of people who are trapped through no fault of their own with the same issues in over 18 metres buildings. You're going to make them pay loans. You're going to ruin property prices. It's very dangerous. And you really need to think there's intended consequences and there's unintended consequences. You just need to start again. It's not acceptable. We're not going to take the loans. It's a cladding tax. That's exactly what it is.
Giles, thank you very much for joining us. And Robert, Giles mentioned MPs are now sort of getting involved in fairly large numbers on both sides, but particularly on the Conservative side. We had Jake Berry on the programme before Prime Minister's question saying he wouldn't accept anything less than actually also paying out for those who are in buildings under 18 metres. You'll have a problem on your hand politically too.
Well, I think we should just welcome what the Secretary of State has announced today.
All right. Well, let's welcome that and put that aside. But what about going further? If you're going to have a political problem.
Well, I'm sure all of those concerns from colleagues on all sides of the House will be heard by the relevant ministers, and if there's, they'll consider that policy as they do at all time and keep that under review. But
Emily,
for today, this is a major step forward.
Emily, why should the taxpayer foot the bill here? Why shouldn't it be building companies or manufacturers that have been involved in this? Why should it be taxpayers?
Well, I kind of agree. And the government have promised 17 times that they're going to protect leaseholders and taxpayers when it comes to dealing with this issue. And the issue is about not just Grenfell-style cladding, which in Grenfell, of course, happened 3.5 years ago. It isn't just about buildings that are over 18 metres with that specific type of cladding, but there's all kinds of other things, such as has been said, balconies with wood on. I mean, I have buildings in my constituency that are like that, or we have buildings that are under 18 metres. They're still lethal, whether they're under 18 metres or whether they're over 18 metres, quite frankly. Now, they promised that leaseholders would not have to carry the can, and yet we're now being told, oh, well, some leaseholders will, but don't worry, it's only it's a loan, and other leaseholders won't. Well, and for some type of work and not for others. I mean, we've said that we should do the same sort of thing as been done in Australia, which is to set up a national cladding task force, which will look specifically at these issues.
But it will take time, won't it, Emily? It'll take far too long, and they've already been waiting for years.
Well, 3.5 years, exactly, 3.5 years. But nobody seems, in our view, to be properly getting a grip of this issue. We need to find out, we need to have a proper definition of what is deadly cladding, what is urgent fire safety work. How are we going to make sure that leaseholders and taxpayers are protected, and to make sure that the developers of these properties are the ones who are actually paying the price and not the rest of us.
Emily and Robert, thank you very much. This has obviously got some way to go. Politically, it could be a big issue going on for the government, but also the idea of a task force does sound like it could be too lengthy.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of the complaint has been that this has taken so long already, and they really do want to get this solved now. People living in these conditions with this worry is clearly a problem. But I think there will be lots of Conservatives who aren't happy that this has gone quite far enough, without hearing the detail, but they'll hear more about it. But I think this is going to be an ongoing issue for the government.
Robert Jenrick still on his feet.